What would you do if your husband of 40 years walked into your birthday party, holding another woman's hand, and introduced her as his new girlfriend? Not quietly. Not awkwardly. But before we continue. But proudly. Right in front of everyone you love. Because that's exactly what happened to me. And the strangest part? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw a drink in his face. I smiled. Let me take you back to that night. It was my 67th birthday. My daughter Emily had helped decorate the backyard. Soft string lights hung between the trees. The patio table was covered with cakes, wine glasses, and the kind of food people bring when they think a party will be relaxed and happy. Friends I had known for 30 years were there. Neighbors. Former colleagues from the school where I spent most of my life as a principal. Even a few people my husband Richard insisted on inviting himself. At the time, that detail didn't seem important. But it would later. Music was playing softly in the background. Someone was telling a story near the grill. My neighbor Helen was laughing so loudly that people at the other end of the yard kept turning to look at her. It looked like a normal birthday celebration. But if I'm being honest with you, it didn't feel normal to me. Have you ever had that strange feeling that something in the air is wrong? Like a storm is coming but the sky is still clear? That's exactly what I felt that night. Richard had been acting strange for months. Small things at first. Little cracks in the routine you build with someone after 40 years of marriage. He started taking phone calls in another room. Then he began locking his phone. And before you say it, yes, I noticed immediately. After 4 decades with someone, you don't just know their habits. You know their patterns. And when those patterns change, you notice. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I watched. Because there's something I learned during my years working in education. When someone is lying, the truth usually reveals itself if you stay quiet long enough. So I stayed quiet. But the changes kept piling up. Richard started dressing differently. Suddenly caring about his appearance again. Cologne every morning. New shirts. And then came the strange generosity. Flowers. Compliments. He even suggested we host a big birthday party for me. Now here's the funny part. Richard hated parties. 40 years of marriage and he had avoided hosting almost every event imaginable. Yet suddenly he wanted a big gathering. Invite everyone, he said. Let's make it special. At the time, I smiled and thanked him. But inside, a question started forming. Why now? Why suddenly this big celebration? Why insist that certain people attend? Why ask me 3 separate times whether my lawyer friend Daniel would be there? That one really caught my attention. Because Daniel Ortega wasn't just a family friend. He was my attorney. And Richard knew that. So why would he care whether Daniel attended my birthday party? Strange, right? And then something happened that made the pieces start falling into place. One morning, about 6 months before the party, I received a notification from our bank. A large withdrawal. From our joint retirement account. Now before I go further, let me ask you something. If you suddenly saw tens of thousands of dollars leaving your retirement account, would you ignore it? Of course not. Neither did I. When I asked Richard about it, he smiled casually. It's just an investment, he said. Simple. Dismissive. But here's the thing. For 30 years I managed school budgets. Numbers were part of my daily life. And when someone gives you a vague answer about money, that's usually not a good sign. So instead of arguing, I did something else. I called Daniel. Quietly. Privately. I asked him to look into something for me. And what he found surprised even him. But we'll get to that later. Because the real story begins on the night of the party. Back in the backyard. Under those soft lights. with 30 people laughing and talking. Richard was acting different that evening. Confident. Almost excited. He kept checking his watch. Looking toward the driveway. As if he was waiting for someone. Emily noticed it too. My daughter walked over and whispered, "Mom, is Dad acting weird to you tonight?" I simply smiled and told her not to worry. But inside, I already knew. I knew something was about to happen. Because the truth is, by the time my birthday arrived, I had already discovered something about Richard. Something he never expected me to find. But I kept that knowledge to myself. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse him. I waited. And then, right around sunset, a car pulled into the driveway. Richard immediately set his drink down and walked toward the gate. That's when the whispering started. Because a young woman stepped out of the car. Much younger than Richard. Tall. Confident. Holding his hand. And suddenly the air in the backyard felt very different. People began glancing at each other. Some of them looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. And then Richard did something that still feels surreal when I remember it. He walked into the center of the yard. Raised his glass. And said something that made the entire party go silent. "This," he said proudly, "is Chloe, my girlfriend." You could have heard a pin drop. My daughter stood up so fast her chair fell backward. Helen nearly spilled her wine. And every single person in that yard turned to look at me. Waiting. Waiting to see what I would do. But instead of yelling, instead of crying, I simply smiled. Then I reached into my purse. And pulled out something I had been carrying with me all night. A sealed envelope. Richard's expression changed the moment he saw it. Because he recognized it. And calmly, very calmly, I looked at him and asked one question. "Are you sure you want her to see this?" And suddenly, the man who thought he was humiliating me didn't look nearly as confident anymore. But the truth was, that envelope didn't just contain a secret. It contained something that would destroy every lie Richard had been telling for months. And the most shocking part? Chloe had no idea. What would you do if you discovered your husband was lying to two different women at the same time, and neither of them knew the full story? Would you confront him immediately? Or would you stay quiet, and wait until the truth revealed itself in front of everyone? Because that's exactly the choice I had to make 6 months before my birthday party. The envelope in my purse that night didn't appear by accident. It was the result of months of watching, listening, and slowly putting together a puzzle that Richard thought I would never notice. Let me explain. The first real clue appeared on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No secret messages popping up on a screen. Just a bank notification. You see, Richard and I had always shared a joint retirement account. 40 years of saving. 40 years of planning what the later part of our lives would look like. Quiet mornings. Travel. Maybe a small cottage somewhere by the water. But that morning, when the notification appeared on my phone, I noticed something strange. A withdrawal. A very large withdrawal. Now before I go further, let me ask you something. If tens of thousands of dollars suddenly disappeared from your retirement account, would you ignore it? Of course not. So I waited until Richard came home that evening. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked. "Did you move money from the account today?" He barely looked up from his phone. "Oh, that," he said casually. "Just an investment opportunity." Simple answer. Too simple. After 30 years managing school finances, I had developed a habit of noticing when numbers didn't add up. And that explanation? It didn't add up. But instead of arguing, I nodded. Sometimes silence is more powerful than confrontation. Because when people think you believe their story, They get careless. And Richard got careless. Over the next few weeks I started noticing more small details. Late-night phone calls. Quick trips he described as meeting old colleagues. And something that made my instincts scream louder than anything else. He began locking his phone. Now some of you might think that's normal. But after 40 years of marriage? Suddenly locking your phone is like suddenly putting a padlock on your diary. It raises questions. But again, I didn't confront him. Instead, I made a phone call. Not to a friend. Not to my daughter. To Daniel Ortega. Daniel had been our family lawyer for years. He was also one of the few people I trusted completely. When I explained the financial withdrawal, Daniel became very quiet. "Margaret," he said slowly, "do you want me to take a closer look at this?" I remember pausing before answering. Because deep down, I already suspected what he might find. "Yes," I told him. "Look into it." A few days later Daniel called me back. And the first thing he said made my stomach tighten. "There's another name involved." Another name. Think about that for a moment. If your lawyer told you there was another name connected to your husband's financial activity, what would you assume? Because my mind immediately jumped to one possibility. A woman. Daniel continued speaking. The name appeared in several recent financial documents Richard had filed. And that name was Chloe Bennett. At the time, the name meant nothing to me. Just a stranger. But Daniel kept digging. And what he discovered next completely changed how I handled the situation. Richard hadn't just been moving money. He had been telling someone a very specific story. According to several messages Daniel managed to legally review, Richard had been telling Chloe something shocking. He told her he was already divorced. Let that sink in for a moment. He had been dating another woman. While telling her his wife of 40 years didn't exist anymore. Can you imagine hearing that? I sat there in silence while Daniel explained everything he had found. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Richard's office and confront him. But another part of me, the calmer part, realized something important. If Richard was lying to Chloe, then Chloe didn't know the truth either. Which meant two people were being manipulated. And that changed everything. Because suddenly this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about exposure. Daniel asked me an important question. "Do you want to confront him now?" I thought about it. For a long moment. Then I shook my head. "No," I said. "Not yet." You see, Daniel had also uncovered something else. Something that made the entire situation far more interesting. Richard had been telling Chloe he planned to make their relationship public very soon. He even mentioned a specific event. My birthday party. That's when he planned to introduce her. Daniel sounded shocked when he told me that. But strangely, I wasn't. Because suddenly Richard's recent behavior made perfect sense. The sudden interest in hosting my birthday. The guest list he insisted on controlling. The strange confidence he had been carrying around for weeks. He believed he was about to humiliate me publicly. He believed I would be too shocked, too embarrassed, to respond in front of everyone. But Richard didn't know something. By that point, I had already started preparing for that exact moment. Daniel and I spent the next few weeks gathering documents. Financial records. Account transfers. Property agreements Richard had secretly filed. And every new discovery made one thing clearer. Richard wasn't just lying. He was digging himself deeper into a hole. But there was one detail that fascinated me the most. Chloe had no idea. She genuinely believed Richard was a divorced man starting a new chapter of his life. Which meant when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just shock Richard. It would shock her too. So I made a decision. I would wait. I would let Richard carry out his little plan. Let him walk into my birthday party thinking he controlled the narrative. And when the moment arrived, I would simply show everyone the truth. But even I didn't realize just how dramatic that moment would become. Because on the night of the party, when Richard walked through that gate holding Chloe's hand, something happened that none of us expected. And it started the exact moment Chloe looked around the yard and realized something about the situation didn't match the story Richard had told her. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately realized something didn't match the story you were told? That subtle moment when your instincts whisper, something is wrong here. Because that's exactly what happened the second Chloe stepped into my backyard. Richard walked beside her with his hand proudly wrapped around hers, smiling the way he used to smile years ago when he believed he had completely charmed a room. But Chloe's expression told a different story. She looked around slowly. Confused. Careful. As if she was searching for something that should have been there, but wasn't. And I realized something in that moment. She was expecting a completely different situation. Let me explain what the scene looked like from where I was sitting. The backyard lights had just started glowing as the sun dipped below the trees. Music floated softly from the speakers Emily had set up earlier. Guests stood in small clusters talking, laughing, holding glasses of wine. It looked like a happy gathering. Until Richard walked through the gate. The whispers started immediately. Not loud whispers. The quiet kind people make when they're trying not to be obvious. You know the kind. People leaning slightly toward each other. Eyebrows lifting. Eyes darting from the young woman on Richard's arm, to me. And suddenly the party that had felt warm and relaxed only seconds before became tense. Emily noticed first. My daughter was standing near the patio table arranging plates when she saw them enter. Her body went completely still. She looked from Richard to Chloe, then across the yard until her eyes met mine. I could see the question forming in her expression. Mom, what is happening? I simply gave her a small smile. A quiet signal. Stay calm. Because by that point, I already knew what was about to unfold. Richard walked Chloe across the yard like he was escorting her onto a stage. And in a way, he was. He led her directly into the center of the gathering. Then he did something that made the entire situation feel even more surreal. He picked up his wine glass and gently tapped it with a spoon. Clink. 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 The sound cut through every conversation. 30 heads turned in his direction. People smiled politely, assuming he was about to give a birthday toast. But instead, Richard cleared his throat and spoke with the kind of confidence only someone completely unaware of the consequences could have. Everyone, he said with a wide grin, I'd like to introduce someone special. Now let me ask you something. If you were sitting where I was sitting, hearing those words, knowing everything I knew at that point, what would you feel? Anger? Humiliation? Shock? For a brief moment I felt none of those things. Just curiosity. Because I wanted to see how far he would take the lie. Richard squeezed Chloe's hand and pulled her slightly forward. This, he announced proudly, is Chloe, my girlfriend. Silence. Not the soft kind. The heavy kind. The kind that falls over a room when everyone suddenly realizes something deeply uncomfortable has just happened. Someone near the grill dropped, and Emily shot to her feet so quickly her chair toppled backward onto the patio stones. Every single pair of eyes in the yard turned toward me. Waiting. Waiting for the explosion. Waiting for tears. Waiting for the kind of scene people whisper about for years afterward. But I didn't give them that. Instead, I simply sat there. Calm. Still. Smiling. And that confused everyone. Especially Richard. Because humiliation only works when the other person reacts the way you expect them to. But when they don't, that's when things become unpredictable. Richard looked slightly irritated by my lack of response. Margaret, he said casually, almost mockingly, I hope you don't mind. I figured honesty was better than pretending. Chloe glanced at him quickly when he said that. Then her eyes moved across the yard again. And that's when something interesting happened. She looked at me. Really looked at me. And I saw the moment confusion began to creep across her face. Because Richard had clearly told her a story. A story where his wife wasn't present. A story where the marriage had already ended. But there I was. Sitting 10 feet away. At my own birthday party. Surrounded by friends who clearly knew exactly who I was. You could almost see the gears in Chloe's mind turning. Something didn't match. Something about this scene was very different from what she had expected. Richard, however, was too busy enjoying the attention to notice. He took a sip of wine and continued speaking like he was delivering a speech. I think it's time everyone knew the truth, he said. Emily stepped forward. Dad, she snapped, what are you doing? Richard barely looked at her. Relax, Emily. Your mother deserves honesty. Honesty. The irony of that word nearly made me laugh. Because if there was one thing Richard had been avoiding for months, it was honesty. And that's when I decided the moment had arrived. Slowly, calmly, I reached into my purse. The movement was small. Quiet. But Richard noticed it instantly. His eyes locked onto my hand as I pulled out a sealed envelope. A plain envelope. Nothing dramatic. But the effect it had on Richard's face was immediate. His smile flickered. Then vanished completely. Because he recognized it. Daniel had mailed those documents to me 2 weeks earlier. And Richard had seen the envelope sitting on my desk one evening before I tucked it away. He never asked about it. Probably assumed it was nothing important. But now, seeing it in my hand, in front of everyone, he looked nervous. Very nervous. I stood up slowly. The yard remained completely silent. Even the music had faded into the background. Then I looked directly at Richard. And asked one simple question. Are you sure, I said calmly, you want her to see this? Chloe turned her head toward him immediately. What is that? She asked. Richard's jaw tightened. Margaret, he said sharply, don't start being dramatic. But it was already too late. Because Chloe's eyes had shifted from him, to the envelope in my hand. And something about the tension between us clearly made her uneasy. Richard, she said slowly. He didn't answer. He was staring at the envelope like it might explode. And that's when I did something he definitely wasn't expecting. Instead of handing the envelope to him, I extended it toward Chloe. The entire yard held its breath. Go ahead, I told her gently. Read it. Richard suddenly stepped forward. But what he said next only made the situation worse. Why would a man panic over a simple envelope? That was the question written all over everyone's faces the moment Richard stepped forward. Because a few seconds earlier he had been confident. Proud. Almost theatrical in the way he announced Chloe to the entire party. But now? Now he looked nervous. Not slightly uncomfortable. Nervous. The kind of nervous that spreads across a person's face when they suddenly realize a situation has slipped out of their control. He reached for the envelope in my hand. Not aggressively. But quickly. Margaret, he said through a tight smile, this isn't the time. That line alone made several people exchange looks. Because what exactly wasn't the time? The time for what? I gently pulled the envelope back before he could take it. And the moment I did that, the tension in the yard doubled. Richard lowered his voice. What are you doing? He whispered. I kept my tone calm. I'm answering your honesty speech. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned closer. People might pretend they don't like drama, but when it appears unexpectedly in front of them, curiosity always wins. Chloe was watching both of us carefully now. Her confusion had turned into something sharper. Suspicion. Richard, she said slowly, what is in that envelope? He didn't answer. Instead, he laughed nervously. Oh, this is ridiculous, he said loudly, turning toward the crowd. Margaret always had a flair for theatrics. But the problem with that explanation was simple. No one was laughing. Because if I had been the dramatic one in our marriage, everyone there would have known. And the truth was the opposite. For 40 years I had been the calm one. The quiet one. Which meant when I finally stood up holding that envelope, people understood something serious was happening. Chloe took a small step toward me. Can I see it? She asked. Richard's voice snapped out immediately. No. Too fast. Too sharp. And that reaction told Chloe everything she needed to know. She looked at him slowly. Why not? Richard rubbed the back of his neck, clearly searching for an answer. It's just financial paperwork, he muttered. Now let me ask you something. If someone tells you something is just paperwork but refuses to let you see it, would you believe them? Chloe didn't. Her expression hardened. You told me you had nothing to hide, she said quietly. Richard's confidence was completely gone now. And for the first time that evening, he looked at me with something close to fear. But the moment had already passed the point where he could stop it. So I placed the envelope gently into Chloe's hands. You deserve to know the truth, I told her. The entire yard remained silent as she slowly opened it. Inside were several documents. At first she looked confused. Just papers. Numbers. Signatures. Then she started reading more carefully. The first page was a financial transfer document. The second page showed the attempted purchase of a condominium. The third page. That was the one that changed everything. Because it clearly stated where the money had come from. Our retirement account. Chloe frowned. Then she looked up at Richard. You said you were buying a place for us, she said. Richard didn't respond. Chloe looked back down at the document again. Then her eyes moved to the name listed under ownership. And suddenly her expression froze. She read the line again. Slowly. Out loud. Margaret Lawson. Several people in the yard gasped quietly. Chloe looked up again, completely stunned. This condo, she said. Her voice trailed off. Richard tried to interrupt. Chloe, it's complicated. No, she said firmly. Then she lifted another page from the envelope. This one contained a printed set of messages. Messages Daniel had legally recovered. Messages between Richard and Chloe. But Chloe had never seen the other side of the story. Until now. She read silently for several seconds. Then her shoulders slowly stiffened. You told me she left you, Chloe said quietly. Richard's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. You told me the divorce was finished. More silence. You told me she didn't care about you anymore. At this point several of our guests looked deeply uncomfortable. Others looked furious. Emily stood beside me now, arms crossed tightly. Richard finally tried to regain control. Chloe, listen to me, he said urgently. Margaret is twisting things. That's when a calm voice spoke from behind the crowd. No, the voice said. She isn't. Everyone turned. Daniel Ortega stepped forward. He had arrived late to the party and had been standing quietly near the gate. But now he moved into the center of the yard. Those documents are authentic, Daniel said calmly. Richard stared at him like he had just seen a ghost. You. Daniel didn't let him finish. The attempted transfer of retirement funds, he continued, was legally blocked 2 weeks ago. Chloe's eyes widened. You tried to move money without her permission, she asked. Richard looked trapped. Sweat had begun forming on his forehead. I was going to explain everything, he said desperately. But the words sounded weak. Unconvincing. Because by that point the truth was already written on paper. Chloe lowered the documents slowly. Then she looked at Richard with an expression I didn't expect. Not anger. Disappointment. Deep disappointment. You told me she was cruel, Chloe said quietly. You told me she destroyed your life. She gestured toward me. But she's standing here, calmly letting me read the truth. Richard tried again. Chloe, please. But she stepped back. Away from him. The distance between them suddenly felt enormous. And that's when Chloe did something no one in that yard predicted. She turned toward me. And spoke directly to me. But what she said next would shock everyone standing there. Have you ever expected anger, and instead received an apology? Because that was the last thing anyone at that party expected Chloe to do. She stood there for a moment holding the papers, the backyard completely silent around her. 30 people watching. Waiting. And then she looked straight at me. I'm sorry, she said. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The kind of apology that comes from someone who has just realized they were standing in the middle of someone else's lie. You could actually feel the shift in the air when she said it. Because until that moment, everyone had assumed Chloe was the villain of the story. The younger woman. The girlfriend. The person who had knowingly walked into someone else's marriage. But suddenly the situation looked very different. Chloe turned slowly toward Richard. You told me she hated you, she said. Richard looked completely defeated now. Gone was the confident man who had walked through the gate 30 minutes earlier. His shoulders had dropped. His voice sounded smaller. Chloe. I was going to explain everything. She shook her head. No. You weren't. Then she lifted the documents again. You said the condo was for us. Richard rubbed his temples. It was complicated. But Chloe pointed at the page again. It says Margaret Lawson owns it. Now here's something interesting about lies. One lie can sometimes survive. 2 lies get shaky. But when 3 or 4 lies collide at the same time, they collapse. And Richard's entire story was collapsing right there in front of everyone. Emily stepped closer to me. Mom, she whispered, did you know about all of this? I nodded. Quietly. Because the truth is, I had known for weeks. Daniel stepped forward again, speaking calmly. The property purchase failed, he explained. Because the funds Richard attempted to use legally required Margaret's authorization. A few people in the crowd murmured. Richard looked at Daniel like he wanted to argue. But he couldn't. Because Daniel was right. Richard finally looked at me. For the first time that evening, not with arrogance. But with something else. Desperation. Margaret, he said quietly, we can talk about this privately. I tilted my head slightly. Why? I asked. That simple question seemed to drain what little confidence he had left. You didn't seem interested in privacy earlier. A few people nearby couldn't help letting out quiet laughs. And that's when the full irony of the situation finally hit everyone. Richard had organized this moment. He had chosen the audience. He had chosen the stage. He had believed this party would end with him publicly humiliating his wife. Instead, he was the one standing alone in front of everyone. Chloe folded the documents and placed them back inside the envelope. Then she walked toward Richard. For a moment, it looked like she might forgive him. But instead she simply handed the envelope back to him. You should keep this, she said. Richard took it slowly. Still silent. Then Chloe turned to me again. I didn't know, she said sincerely. I believe you, I replied. And I did. Because something about the way she carried herself made it clear she had just been another piece of Richard's plan. She had believed his version of the story. Until reality arrived. Then Chloe did something simple. She walked toward the gate. No dramatic speech. No shouting. No scene. Just quiet dignity. As she reached the driveway, she stopped briefly. Then she turned back toward Richard. And said something that would stay with him long after that night ended. "You didn't lose your marriage tonight," she said calmly. "You lost your lies." Then she got into her car and drove away. The backyard remained silent for a few seconds after that. Everyone processing what they had just witnessed. Richard stood there staring at the ground. Still holding the envelope. Still trying to figure out how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Finally he looked at me again. "I never wanted it to happen like this," he muttered. "Now let me ask you something. When someone says that after months of deception, do you believe them?" Because I didn't. But surprisingly, I also didn't feel angry. I felt relieved. Because the truth had finally come out. No shouting. No courtroom. Just a quiet moment where everyone saw reality clearly. Daniel walked over and stood beside me. "You handled that perfectly," he said softly. I smiled. "Sometimes the best response," I told him, "is patience." Emily wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "You're unbelievable, Mom," she whispered. Across the yard, Richard finally began moving toward the gate. Slowly. Avoiding eye contact with everyone. The man who had arrived confident and proud was now leaving quietly. Just before he stepped out of the yard, he paused. Turned slightly. And looked back at me. But I didn't say anything. Because there was nothing left to say. He walked out. The gate closed. And just like that, the drama was over. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Helen cleared her throat. "Well," she said loudly, lifting her wine glass again, "that was the most exciting birthday party I've attended in years." A ripple of laughter spread across the yard. The tension finally breaking. Someone turned the music back on. Conversation slowly restarted. Life resumed. And a few minutes later Emily carried the birthday cake out to the table. Candles glowing softly in the evening air. She placed it in front of me and smiled. "Make a wish, Mom." I looked around at the friends who had stayed. The lights. The quiet music. And I realized something important. Richard thought he had ruined my birthday. But instead, he had given me something far better. Freedom. Emily leaned close as I prepared to blow out the candles. "Mom," she whispered. "You knew all along, didn't you?" I smiled. "Yes. I did. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply letting someone finish telling their lie. Before you show everyone the truth."